Hello and welcome. We're doing some analytical physiognomy of rings of power characters. Let's just get right into it. I'll explain on the way if this is the first one of these you're seeing. So we're going to start with the elves, and I just put on some pictures here of some of the different characters and their faces, because that's what we're going to be reading. And this is going to be a little different than normal because we're looking at mythological creatures. And so some of the physiognomic emotional types are going to be a bit different. There's some standards that you want to follow if you want a believable elf character. And so right off the bat, most of these characters are not believable elf kind of archetypes, physiognomic archetypes. And what that does when you don't have a believable emotional type is it breaks any sort of immersion or belief in that character. And so beyond any sort of plot or production or background or costumes or anything like that, the most important part of a show or art or movie or whatever, to have believable characters, you need to match their emotional types with what the character is doing, with their actions and with their environment. And so if you don't have that, no matter the level of production, your show's not going to be believable. We're not going to believe any of these characters because if they're displaying the wrong emotional types, if they're displaying false emotional types to what they're supposed to be, then they aren't going to be involved correctly in their environment, in their role, and then in turn we won't believe that character because that character doesn't believe in their environment, or that character doesn't believe in the world around them or their own actions. And so this is super important. You can have a terrible show but still have enjoyable characters that ultimately are immersed in their world, even if the production and the plot is bad. No matter how good your production or plot is, if you don't have the right casting, then no matter what, we're not going to believe the story. And this is oftentimes unconscious. We don't realize what it is about a story we don't like. Not to say that they're bad actors. They're just oftentimes wrongly cast. And for the elves, that's the case for pretty much all of them. And we're going to take a look at that right now. So I'm just going to zoom in here. So we have Galadriel, and what we're looking for is the contours of some of the different features here, such as the eyes and the eyebrows and the mouth. And so here we have closed eyebrows because they're flat. They're just straight along the nose ridge here, meaning she doesn't display a lot of emotions, and she's usually more introverted, more about the self, thinking, more contemplative, more self-involved or self-indulgent. And then the open mouth gives her character, the open mouth expression here makes her almost dumbfounded with this kind of expression. It's almost like she's not believing what she's seeing. So this is what we would call like a false emotional type. She's displaying the wrong emotions to her standard emotional type. Here, as you can see, this looks much more like she's supposed to, with closed eyes, closed eyebrows, and closed mouth. So for an emotional type like this, with all closed features, you have a very stoic and passive personality type, and it can be hard to do a main character like this if they're not meant to play that role. So what that tells us is that for her character, she is pretty much single-minded in achieving her goals. She doesn't care about anyone but herself and what she's trying to do, and she's not going to display many other emotions. And as you can see, when she's displaying other emotions, she looks false. She looks in disbelief. It doesn't fit her face when she's smiling or frowning or has an open mouth in the resting position. because that's not her emotional type. That makes her character hard to believe. It doesn't really give us a good sense of what she's trying to do. Her emotions are very inwardly expressed, or they're not expressed because they're inward. We have a hard time relating to her because she's not displaying any emotions. She's very stoic. To make a believable elf character, what you actually need to do is you need to align the point of the ear, just draw an angle here, with the eyebrows and the eyes. And I don't mean the points need to touch, they need to flow in the same general direction. For her character, they did the ears wrong, which basically when you do it wrong, you end up just looking like a human with pointy ears. You don't look like an actual elf. Let's take a look at another one of the characters. So we have the ear flows in this direction, and then we have the eyes, the eyebrows and the eyes going in the wrong direction. And so he doesn't look like an elf, just a human with pointy ears. And actually, this character, Elrond, I think, he actually has one of the best elves. He's one of the most believable characters as an elf because the eyes and the eyebrows are much closer to flowing in the same direction. His ears flow where the contours of his eyes and eyebrows are, and that's what you need. Here again, you can probably see it easier. It's almost all going in the same direction, which makes him look more like an elf. We have this character here. Ears are more or less pointed this, while the eyes are going the wrong way. Doesn't look like an elf. Her brother actually looks the most like an elf because his ears are flowing in the same direction as his eyes and his eyebrows. If we were to give like a standard elf emotional type, it would be what we call joyful eyebrows, which is eyebrows that are contoured up like that. Joyful eyes, which are also contoured up like that, with a pointed ears flowing in the same direction as the eyes and the eyebrows. And then you usually want like a frown, or what we call sad mouth, or even just closed mouth is okay. And that helps kind of elongate the face a bit. And so you can see here with his character, he's got more of that kind of frown going on. Even though the eyebrows aren't joyful and the eyes aren't joyful, he still works as an elf because the ear is more matched with that angle. And what that means is he's more of a thinker. He's more contemplative, a lot like Galadriel, except he looks like an elf where she doesn't because he has the right ear, eye, and eyebrow alignment. And so I just found random pictures from the internet of elves so you can see what I mean about that. So this top half above the red line here are correct elves, and the bottom half are incorrect elves. Or rather, I should say that they don't look as much like elves. So this first person's actually from a show called The Sandman. This is Lucien. In my opinion, one of the best shows out right now. I should probably do one of these videos on that show because most of the characters, if not all of them, have the correct emotional type for their characters, which makes the show more immersive. And that could really highlight a more positive application of analytical physiognomy. Even though she's not strictly meant to be an elf character, she has pointed ears aligned with her eyes and eyebrows. They're flowing in pretty much the right direction as the ears. And her character is a librarian, so she's meant to be more scholarly, which means she's giving the right facial expression with her kind of mythological archetype in the right role of character of being a more thinker type of, because of the closed eyes. Here are just more elves from drawings or games or whatever I could find. believable elf because of the angles all work. Same thing for that one. This one more or less has the general alignment, so I put it on the top. And on this elf, you have the right angles. And then again here, you're seeing the right angles here. And then on this drawing, you can see this is what I mean by the best, most like elf-like. If you really want to be more of like a creature, you want joyful eyes, joyful eyebrows, and joyful ears. So this is one of the best examples of an elf that I could find. And even if you want to do a sad elf expression, you actually can. The ears need to angle down, and that's what we get with the eyes of this character. And this is why he's so likable and believable, because he is displaying the right kind of emotions for his kind of character, his environment, and his mythological creature. You should get the idea by now how important it can be to do it right. And so just like most of the Rings of Power characters, these elves they don't really look like elves because they don't have the right angles. So you can kind of see the difference of what looks like a human with pointy ears and what looks like an actual elf. And so now that you kind of have that idea, let's look back at the characters from the Rings of Power and see now what I mean, how only one or two of these characters look correctly like elves, while some of them are pretty close. I would say he's probably the third best elf. This guy's not really much of a character, so it doesn't really count. So I guess you could say he's the second best elf, and Elrond's actually probably the best. One more thing to add before I move on from the elves. So they either did a really bad job casting some of these characters in general, but especially her as one of the protagonists. But because her emotional type doesn't match what her character's doing and the world around her, we aren't drawn to her character, and we don't believe her character, and we ultimately won't like her character, which means one of two things. Either the show really messed up in casting her, and they casted her for other reasons than her fitting it, or that this is not the character she's going to end up being. We're going to see a wildly different transformation, and whether that's she alters her appearance to match her emotional type better, or she starts to do more evil, selfish things. To give the show the benefit of the doubt, we'll say that her character arc is going to take a much, say, probably darker turn. She's probably going to turn out to be more evil or do a lot of more questionable actions. And that's one way that analytical physiognomy can help you predict certain things in like shows, because it's either they miscasted her really poorly, but again, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt and say they did it correctly, and that what you're seeing right now, you have to wait because it's going to build up into a much different kind of character. But overall, most of the characters seem miscasted, in my opinion, and so it probably is that they just messed that up for her character. But we'll see if the prediction is correct, that she ends up more evil, or more evil to match her emotional type. Moving on, we have the dwarves. Now there's only really two dwarf characters so far that they actually, like we actually saw talking as like characters, and both of them are not very good as dwarves, because just like the elves, there's certain qualities to the dwarf that you would expect to see to make a believable dwarf. Most of these guys just look more like funky Viking characters. They don't really look like dwarves. So obviously they have like the big noses. That's pretty typical. But you want to see much more brooding eyebrows. You want to see very stern looking faces. And for the dwarf, their whole character, or their whole folklore, is that they are in the mountains, underground, mining and building things. And part of your physiognomic expression is you're displaying the emotional type of your actions and beliefs and what you do. And so if you're constantly doing like hard labor underground in the dark, you expect to have the kind of brooding eyebrows, that kind of squinting, heavy set eyebrows with deep set eyes, large nose, because you imagine the air is probably harder to breathe. You need a more area, more surface area. And then the mouth probably going to be more like a frown or just covered by a beard. And then you want to have really etched in features. You want them to look like stone or granite because that's what they deal with all the time. You want pretty much permanently etched out features. And here in Rings of Power, we have features that are too soft. They're not really deep set. You just have kind of this nose and beard, but you're missing the eyes and the eyebrows. They don't really match. And same thing for her character. She doesn't have the right qualities of a dwarf, which is the much more brooding eyebrows and eyes and the more deep set features that seem like they're carved from stone because that's what they deal with. And I know this is from The Hobbit, but the dwarves are, I think, were much better done for the most part so far than from the couple we've seen from Rings of Power. You have much more, for some of these characters, you have much stronger eyebrows. You have the much more brooding faces and the more frowny expressions. And still you have the large beards and the large noses. And for dwarves, you need a lot of metal. You need a lot of like nose rings or beard rings or different sorts of ornamentation on their body, different sorts of piercings and jewelry that helps to make them more metallic, more stone-like, and more hardy, and just make them look like they lead the life that they're supposed to. This one doesn't look like it for either of these characters. You don't really get that sense in their emotional types or how they did the cosmetics, since obviously we're dealing with mythological creatures. But in general, just like the elves, you want to find people who have those kinds of features that you're looking for that are more aligned to building that mythological creature to make it believable. So I think for the dwarves so far that we've seen, they aren't a very well casted, or they didn't do the makeup and cosmetics and costumes very well to be the kind of dwarves that they're trying to be. So I think that's another instance of the show missing their casting, which ultimately we are going to take out on every other quality of the show except for the casting, because this is unconscious and we don't realize that this is what it is that's making the show less enjoyable to us, because there's no immersion, because the characters, they aren't representing themselves or their environment properly. They're in disbelief and displaying false emotional types, and so we don't believe that if the character doesn't believe it. Moving on to the Harfoots, which I'm assuming is just like woodland halflings, or hobbits, I should say. I don't really, like I said, I don't really know all the lore or the story, so I'm just basing this off of my impressions are of these characters. For hobbits, you want very childish expressions and facial features. You want them to have generally wider eyes and less thick eyebrows and just more childish features because of their folk mythological physiognomic archetype is you have kind of a eternally youthful, short person. You could say they're smaller and they're childish or childlike appearance. The other thing you can do is take that and make them into to have very old features on a very small body. That is another way that the Hobbit can be believable. And actually, out of all of the characters, I think the Harfoots are done the best. The main girl, she has the right kind of facial features for her character, which is that she has open eyebrows, open eyes, and an open mouth. And what that means is she's extremely outgoing and curious of the world around her. You can see in even just these still frames, she's actively curious and looking at the world around her. What this also means, though, is that there's not a lot of deep thinking and there's not a lot of contemplating of their actions. She's very internally absent, but very externally outgoing and always curious about something else without thinking of the consequences. And so that's how her character is always going to be acting, is that she's always going to be getting into situations from exploring and being curious. And look at the difference between her and her friend displaying the same emotions of surprise. And her, she's actively looking at the situation and she's curious about it and she's not afraid of it, even though it's meant to be a surprising situation. That's her natural emotional type. And so that's what she's suited for, is seeing surprising things. And her friend, on the other hand, who's meant to be more stay at home and secure and not to venture out and do anything rash. And you can see that with the same facial expression, she actually looks scared and panicking and like surprised, shocked, fearful expression. And that's just one way of having believable characters. You want the character to be the more introverted, let's not do anything stupid, to have that kind of expression when faced with something that your more adventurous character is going to start attracting and start actively seeking. And then she's not going to think about what her actions are doing while she's going to be overthinking everything. And those are the kind of characters we see, and that's why they're more believable and why their sort of characters are a lot more immersive, because she's actively involved and correctly displaying the right emotional type for her character and emotional type. And even some of the side characters are well done. He kind of has that old man, Benjamin Button kind of older guy in a smaller childlike body. And then I would say she's probably the least believable of the Harfoots. Maybe the dad as well, but for the like main characters that you see, they are done a lot better anyways than the elves and the dwarves, in my opinion, based off of their emotional types. Here's some other characters. You have the Jesus dude. He's kind of like the shamanic nature guy. We haven't really seen his character do much, so it's hard to say. He's probably not displaying the right features, but again, this is just like Galadriel. It may be that they're waiting for his character for something to happen, so then he can start displaying the right emotional type, the right emotional expressions, which you would think to be kind of wild, crazy, probably have multiple different emotional expressions in his face all at once. That's what you'd kind of expect from that sort of aloof nature shaman character. You have the boat guy that Galadriel meets. Has fairly honest consciousness and desires, and with I say probably a closed mouth expression, so his feelings are not expressed. And what this does is he's probably going to be a good voice of reason as he's seeing things properly, but he's not going to say how he feels, which means he's probably going to end up doing things that he may not agree with, but he knows is right, and he'll probably do the right thing ultimately, but not necessarily want to be doing that. The village girl and her son, and again, we haven't really seen too much of what these characters are going to be doing. They're just regular humans. But yeah, we have open expressions again, so we have a very curious person who wants to go on an adventure, and then we have someone who looks more solitary with, she has good ideas, but her feelings and desires are mainly closed off to us. And so for most of these characters, they don't display a lot of emotions except the Harfoot characters so far. And I'm going to bring up some of the cast, just some whatever magazine covers they did. Most of them have pretty neutral facial expressions, which is probably not good for a movie or a TV show, especially in the fantasy world where you want them to be immersed and enamored or enthralled into their world. Most of them are pretty sullen looking and stoic, and so you're not going to get a wide range of emotions from these characters, which could work in some settings, but for 90% of these characters are meant to be mythological creatures. The only ones you really get right are these two characters, I think, with probably Ham and Ham being decent enough. So it's super important to have the right emotional type, or your show or movie or art is not going to be believable. You're going to be displaying false emotions. I have some other videos if you want to see what we do or how we look at the eyebrows and the eyes and the mouth and see what that means about the emotional type and everything like that. But just know that, especially when you're dealing with mythological physiognomy, there are some general standards we unconsciously are more drawn to make us believe what we're seeing, to believe these characters, and to have the characters themselves believe the world around them. So their actions need to match what facial expressions they're making, which is something natural to each person. We all have different physiognomic emotional types, and so you need characters that are going to be the right kind of character that you need. I would say, obviously not knowing if her character is going to take a different direction, they probably needed someone who was going to have much stronger facial features of joyful eyebrows, joyful eyes, and the pointed ears flowing in the right direction. And even if they do take her character in a different direction, she still doesn't have the right elf ears alignment. So no matter what, some of these characters are irredeemable as their mythological types, but there's still parts of them just in their emotional type that can improve. So we'll see if my kind of predictions are right, or see how it all plays out. But if you're wondering why the show is not being received generally too well, or why it seemed boring, or they put all of this money into production and special effects and backgrounds and costumes, and why it doesn't seem to be working, it's all because of this unconscious acknowledgement of emotional expressions that we don't realize is the root cause of why we don't believe the characters, because the characters don't believe themselves. They're displaying false emotions, is what we call it. And so that's super important to get right, no matter how much money you're putting into a show. But again, this either means that they just miscasted everybody or majority of characters, or that they're all going to take a pretty wild turn, and you'll see the characters acting much differently than how you initially see them, because they're displaying the wrong emotional type, which if you have a good casting director or whatever, you'll have those characters get into a role at some point. They're kind of like final character arc, or where they kind of flesh out their character development, is that they're going to slowly go into their proper emotional type. And so you'll see changes along the way if they did it right. And if they didn't do it right, then they're never going to be believable characters. But yeah, I think that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and peace out.